Most tornadoes race east, tearing through towns at 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles per hour. It crawled southwest, grinding over the same neighborhood for 13 agonizing minutes, moving so slowly you could have walked faster than it traveled. And when it finally lifted, there was nothing left. Not wreckage, not debris, just bare concrete slabs where 27 families had lived that morning. The ground itself was scoured down to raw earth. An investigator stood in the middle of Double Creek Estates asking a question that still haunts meteorologists today. How does a tornado move the wrong direction? And why weren't the warnings enough? This is the story of the storm that rewrote the rules, and the science that explains why normal safety measures failed when they were needed most. It felt heavy, oppressive. The kind of Texas spring day where the air sits on your chest like a wet blanket, where you step outside and immediately want to go back in. Temperatures were already climbing into the upper 80s by mid-morning, humidity thick enough to taste. But for central Texas in late May, that wasn't unusual. Storms were expected. They always came this time of year. By late morning, the Storm Prediction Center had identified something brewing over the hill country, something that made veteran meteorologists sit up straighter in their chairs. The numbers coming back from weather balloons were extreme. Cape values, the measure of atmospheric instability, were pushing past 6,000 joules per kilogram. To put that in perspective, anything over 2,000 is considered very unstable. 6,000? That's the kind of energy that doesn't just build storms, it detonates them. An outflow boundary, a leftover scar in the atmosphere from storms the night before, was draped across Williamson County like a tripwire. These boundaries are invisible to the naked eye, but critical to storm formation. They're zones where cool, dense air from old thunderstorms collides with warm, unstable air, creating a spinning motion in the atmosphere, a horizontal vortex just waiting for the right updraft to tilt it vertical. The wording was measured, professional. Very unstable air. Isolated tornadoes possible near boundary intersections. Isolated tornadoes. Possible. No one used the word catastrophic. No one said F5. Because the wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was weak. And conventional wisdom said you couldn't get a violent tornado without strong wind shear. The setup looked perfect for hail, maybe some gustnados, perhaps a brief spin-up or two. By early afternoon, storms began firing along the boundary. But once that cap broke, the atmosphere exploded. Updrafts roared to life, 50,000 feet tall, anvils spreading across the sky like God's own hammer. And along that outflow boundary, the storms found something they needed, rotation. Not from wind shear aloft, but from the boundary itself, that horizontal spin being tilted upward by the monstrous updrafts. Annoying, yes. Photogenic, sure. But not dangerous, except this time the energy was too much, the instability too extreme. And what started as a landspout was about to become something no one expected. At first it was narrow, almost rope-like, the kind of tornado storm chasers love to photograph. It danced across open fields, kicking up dust, looking almost harmless. But it wasn't moving east, it was drifting south, then southwest. Inside the National Weather Service office in Austin, San Antonio, meteorologists were tracking multiple storms. This was an outbreak. 20 tornadoes would touch down across central Texas that afternoon and evening, and the radar screens were lighting up like a Christmas tree. Warnings were being issued, sirens activated, emergency managers on high alert. At 3:38 p.m., just 2 minutes before the Jarrell tornado would enter Double Creek Estates, the WSR-88D radar at Fort Hood went dark, a power issue. The screen that had been painting the supercell in vivid reds and purples suddenly showed nothing. For critical minutes, the primary radar eye over Williamson County was blind. There were other radars, spotter networks, amateur radio operators calling in reports. The warning was already in effect. Sirens were already blaring across Jarrell. People knew a tornado was coming, but the radar outage meant they couldn't see what was happening in real time. Couldn't see the tornado widening, couldn't see it intensifying. Couldn't see it, slowing down as it approached the subdivision on the western edge of town, Let's talk about tornado movement for a moment, because this is where Jarrell becomes truly unusual. They move fast, typically 30 to 40 miles per hour, sometimes faster. You get a few minutes of warning, the tornado roars through, and it's gone. The destruction is terrible, yes, but it's also brief. A matter of seconds, maybe a minute or two at most, in any one location. Some estimates put it even slower during the peak destruction phase. It wasn't being steered by upper-level winds because those winds were weak. Instead, it was being pulled along by the outflow boundary itself, that surface feature draped across the landscape. Some survivors and witnesses reported it seemed to almost stall over the neighborhood. Imagine that. An F5 tornado with winds exceeding 260 miles per hour, grinding over the same houses for 3 minutes. 4 minutes. Some estimates suggest the most intense winds battered the same structures for up to 5 minutes. Jarrell gave some homes 5 minutes of F5 winds. There is no structure on Earth, short of a reinforced concrete bunker, that can withstand that. It was no longer a rope. It was a wedge, 3/4 of a mile wide, so massive that from a distance it looked less like a tornado and more like a wall of boiling darkness. The condensation funnel wrapped in a shroud of dirt, debris, and disintegrating homes. One man, sheltering in a ditch a mile away, said it sounded like the earth itself was being torn apart. No basements. This was Texas. The water table and soil conditions made basements rare and expensive. Just slabs, wood frame construction, brick facades. Typical suburban homes, safe in a thunderstorm, safe in straight-line winds, safe in a normal tornado. But this was not a normal tornado, not collapsed, not destroyed, vanished. The tornado didn't just tear the walls apart, it erased them, grinding wood and brick and drywall into fragments so small that investigators later described the debris field as powdered. Vehicles were mangled beyond recognition, twisted into abstract sculptures of metal and rubber. Trees were debarked, stripped naked, some snapped off at ground level, others ripped entirely out of the earth, roots and all. It scoured the ground, not just the grass, not just the topsoil. The tornado stripped away everything, down to bare clay and bedrock in some places. Asphalt roads were peeled up in sections, chunks of pavement weighing hundreds of pounds hurled away like leaves. Investigators found areas where the ground had been scoured down 6 to 12 inches, entire lawns just gone. It requires winds so violent, so sustained, that they literally excavate the earth. It had been documented before, in a handful of the most intense tornadoes in history, but never to this degree, never over such a wide area. And one by one, they disappeared. They'd heard the sirens. They'd heard the warnings on TV and radio. They knew a tornado was coming, and they did what every safety guide, every emergency manager, every weather broadcast tells you to do when you don't have a basement. Get to an interior room. Get away from windows. Cover yourself. Protect your head. They did everything right, because the safety rules we teach, the get to an interior bathroom advice, the shelter in a closet guidance, those rules are designed for typical tornadoes. EF0s, EF1s, even EF2s and EF3s. Tornadoes that last seconds, maybe a minute. Tornadoes that damage homes but leave something standing. Winds estimated at 260 to 300 miles per hour. And it didn't just hit these homes, it consumed them. Walls didn't collapse inward. They were sucked outward and upward, exploded into the vortex. Roofs didn't blow off, they disintegrated. And the people inside, sheltering in interior rooms, found themselves suddenly exposed to winds that could strip flesh from bone. Entire families. The youngest victim was 5 years old. Some bodies were never found. Others were recovered hundreds of yards away, in fields and ditches, so traumatized by the violence of the winds that identification required dental records and DNA. The part that makes you angry, because they did everything right and it still wasn't enough. The part that makes you realize that sometimes nature is simply more powerful than our preparations. But it's also the part that teaches us the most important lesson. Not all tornadoes are the same, and not all shelter is equal. By 3:53 p.m., 13 minutes after it entered Double Creek Estates, it was over. The tornado lifted near a wooded area southeast of the neighborhood, dissipating as suddenly as it had intensified. The parent storm continued south, but the vortex, that horrific column of wind that had just erased the neighborhood, simply stopped. The maximum width, 3/4 of a mile. The duration, roughly 13 minutes from touchdown to dissipation. By tornado standards, it was small, brief, a blip. But in those 13 minutes, it had become one of the most violent, most studied, most feared tornadoes in American history. You train for disaster. You train for collapsed buildings, for fires, for people trapped in rubble. You train to search through wreckage, to listen for voices, to pull survivors from the debris. But there was no debris, not in the way they expected. Bare concrete foundations, swept clean, some still with the plumbing fixtures sticking up like grave markers. There were a few interior walls, shattered and leaning. There were fragments, splinters, unidentifiable pieces of what used to be homes scattered across the fields. But there were no houses, no recognizable structures, nothing to search through. Another said it looked like the neighborhood had been erased by God's hand. The search for survivors began immediately, but hope faded quickly. The violence of the tornado had been so extreme that there were very few injuries. Only 12 to 13 people hurt badly enough to require hospitalization. Everyone else had either sheltered successfully in the few homes that were outside the worst of the damage, or they were gone. 8 families, the deadliest tornado in Texas since the Saragossa F4 in 1987, which killed 30. The deadliest tornado in the United States that year. And the questions began. Why did it move southwest? Why was it so slow? Why was the damage so complete, so total, so unlike anything most investigators had ever seen? In the hours after the tornado lifted, the questions multiplied faster than the answers. First responders needed to know, where do we even begin searching when there's nothing to search? And meteorologists, they were asking a question that would take years to fully answer. What the hell just happened here? Because Jarrell didn't fit the models. It didn't follow the rules. And the more scientists dug into the data, the more they realized this tornado was teaching them something fundamental about the limits of prediction and the terrifying potential of atmospheric boundaries. Kristen LaFrance was 9 years old on May 27, 1997. Her father worked nights, her mother worked days, but on that Tuesday, her mother happened to be home, and that decision, that random twist of scheduling, would determine who lived and who died. Kristen remembered watching the sky darken that afternoon, her mother telling her to go get her father. They stood together in the doorway, watching the horizon, and Kristen squeezed between her parents to see what they were looking at. In the distance, something dark, something massive, something moving toward them. The next thing Kristen remembered was waking up in her front yard. The rain was burning her skin, acidic with debris and chemicals from destroyed homes. Her body was covered in deep gashes, and when she looked around, there was no house, just a concrete slab. Even the asphalt in the street had been torn away. Her father was gone. Her home was gone. Her childhood ended in the time it takes to hold your breath. The odds of surviving that? Astronomical. The odds of surviving it without catastrophic injuries? Nearly impossible. But she did. And 25 years later, she told her story publicly for the first time, sitting in a leather recliner, nervous but finally ready to speak about the day that divided her life into before and after. Garland Elliott worked in town, but her son and his pregnant fiancée were at the house. Survivors told her later that her son had sat on the porch watching as the tornado approached, perhaps not fully understanding what he was seeing, perhaps thinking he had more time. He didn't. The Igo family, all 5 of them, were killed. Larry and Joan Ego and their 3 children, Audrey and the twin boys, John Martin and Paul Wesley. The family ran an auto shop in town, a fixture of the community. Mallory Cantler Sumner, who was 8 years old at the time, remembered driving past the shop that morning, waving at the Ego boys. Her sister had gone to high school with them. They were friends, the Moring family, Keith and Cindy and their 2 sons, Eric and Ryan, gone. Ruth Carmona and her 2 children, Michael Jr. and Satin, gone. 27 people, 8 families. Some were never found intact. Some bodies were recovered hundreds of yards away, in fields and ditches, so traumatized by the violence that identification required dental records and DNA analysis. This is the part of the story that breaks you, because these weren't people who ignored warnings. They weren't people who took foolish risks. They were people who did everything they were supposed to do, and it still wasn't enough. Let's talk about what it means to shelter in place during a tornado, because this is where the science meets the tragedy. The standard advice, the guidance that every weather broadcast repeats, is simple. If you don't have a basement, get to an interior room on the lowest floor. A bathroom, a closet. Stay away from windows. Cover yourself with blankets or a mattress. Protect your head. This advice works. For most tornadoes, an EF-Listroa or EF1 tornado winds up to 110 miles per hour, will damage roofs and break windows, but interior rooms usually survive. An EF2 winds up to 135 miles per hour, will cause significant structural damage, but a well-built interior bathroom often remains standing. Even an EF3 winds up to 165 miles per hour, leaves something behind, some core of the structure where people can survive. But an F5 is different. F5 winds, 261 miles per hour and above, don't just damage structures, they dismantle them. The walls don't collapse inward, they're sucked outward, exploded into the vortex. Roofs don't blow off, they disintegrate, shredded into splinters in milliseconds. And the people inside, sheltering in that interior bathroom, suddenly find themselves exposed to the full fury of the storm. At Jarrell, the tornado didn't just hit the homes in Double Creek Estates, it consumed them, and because it moved so slowly, spending 3 to 5 minutes over the same structures, there was no riding it out. There was only endurance. And no human structure, short of a reinforced concrete bunker, can endure F5 winds for 5 minutes. One woman survived by sheltering in her bathtub, wrapping herself in blankets. The tornado picked up the entire bathtub and flung it several hundred feet from her house onto a road. She survived, but she was one of the very few. Most homes in Central Texas are built on concrete slabs, no basements. The water table is high, the soil expands and contracts with moisture, and basements are expensive and prone to flooding, so people build on slabs, which is fine for normal weather, even for most tornadoes. But when an F5 stalls over your neighborhood, a slab offers no protection. You're essentially sheltering in a structure with no anchor, no underground refuge, nothing between you and winds that can strip flesh from bone. And that is why 27 people died in Double Creek Estates, not because they were careless, not because they didn't prepare, but because the physics of the situation exceeded the limits of residential construction. Mallory Cantler Sumner was 8 years old, swimming with her sisters that afternoon. Her mother rushed them inside as the sky darkened, turned on KXAN, and listened as meteorologist Jim Spencer issued warnings. Mallory remembered her mother pulling the mattress off her bed, the family grabbing the handles on the sides, huddling together in the hallway. Mallory asked her mother a question that no child should have to ask. "Mom, are we going to die?" Her mother's answer was honest, heartbreaking, and human. "I don't know, sweetie, but we're just going to pray, and let's all hang on to the mattress." The house went black. The windows disappeared into darkness. And then, the sound. That freight train roar everyone talks about. The sound that isn't just wind, but the accumulated violence of a vortex tearing apart everything in its path. And then, silence. Mallory's family survived because they were just outside the worst of the damage path. When they finally opened the door and looked out, baseball-sized hail covered their yard. The rain had stopped, and when they looked toward the horizon, toward where Double Creek Estates had been, there was nothing. I remember thinking, "Well, that's odd," Mallory said years later. As an 8-year-old, wonder what happened. And then we started to hear sirens. The sirens that came after. The sirens of ambulances and fire trucks and police cars converging on a neighborhood that no longer existed. 20 miles south, at a Chili's restaurant in Round Rock, Stephanie Irwin was managing the lunch rush when people started pouring in off Interstate 35. They weren't coming in to eat. They were seeking shelter. Texas law enforcement had shut down the interstate, worried the tornado would shift southeast across it. Drivers abandoned their cars, hiding under overpasses and ditches, anywhere they could find cover. And then Stephanie noticed something terrifying. The windows of the restaurant were breathing, bowing inward with the pressure changes, flexing like they were alive. She screamed at people to get away from the windows, to get behind the bar. She ran to the back of the restaurant and opened the kitchen door, trying to relieve the pressure. And that's when she saw it. A table from the parking lot, flipping end over end through the air. The roof of the restaurant next door, gone. She tried to close the door, but the wind was too strong. She pulled with all her strength, screaming at a server who stood frozen in the kitchen, crying. "It's going to be okay." But she didn't know if it was going to be okay. Nobody did. At the KXAN studios in Austin, meteorologist Jim Spencer was watching the radar and making a decision that would save countless lives. KXAN was the first Austin news station to cut into programming, issuing warnings 25 to 30 minutes before the tornado actually developed. Spencer saw the storms firing up near Waco, saw them moving toward Williamson County, and he knew. He didn't wait for confirmation. He didn't wait for the tornado to touch down. He warned people to take shelter immediately. "If you live in a mobile home in the general area," Spencer said on air, his voice urgent but controlled, "you need to get out of the mobile home right now and get to another place." Those warnings gave people time, not much, but enough for some to make decisions that saved their lives. Enough for Mallory's mother to pull her daughters inside. Enough for drivers on I-35 to pull over and seek shelter. But Spencer didn't know, not yet, what was coming. He thought it might be an F3, maybe an F4. It wasn't until a photographer from Oklahoma called in, someone who had seen the Pampa F5 a couple years earlier, that Spencer began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. "This storm," the photographer told him, "looks a whole lot like an F5. Yes, and when Spencer saw the video, shot by KXAN photographer Mike Price from the side of Interstate 35, he knew. That massive 3/4-mile wide wedge, crawling southwest over Double Creek Estates, wasn't just a tornado. It was a monster. F5 tornadoes are rare, extraordinarily rare. Since 1950, when official tornado records began, there have been fewer than 60 F5 or EF5 tornadoes in the United States. That's less than one per year, on average, across the entire country. And most of those occurred in the Great Plains in Tornado Alley, where the atmospheric conditions are more conducive to violent tornadoes. Texas had seen F5 tornadoes before. Wichita Falls in 1979, Lubbock in 1970. But Central Texas, this part of the state, wasn't known for violent tornadoes. About 80% of tornadoes in south central Texas are EF0 or EF1, weak tornadoes that cause minor damage. EF4s and EF5s, those were supposed to happen somewhere else. The original Fujita scale, developed by Dr. Ted Fujita in 1971, classified tornadoes from F0 to F5 based on damage. An F5 was defined as a tornado capable of incredible damage, with winds estimated at 261 to 318 miles per hour. Dr. Fujita believed that winds of 260 to 300 miles per hour were needed to totally flatten and destroy a house or building. In 2006, the scale was updated to the enhanced Fujita scale, which more accurately correlates wind speeds with damage indicators. But the principle remains the same. An EF5 tornado represents the absolute upper limit of what the atmosphere can produce. These are winds that can strip asphalt from roads, scour the ground down to bare earth, and reduce homes to fragments so small they're unrecognizable. Not even a hurricane can produce winds that strong, Jim Spencer said. This is the strongest wind that nature can make on the planet. And Jarrell got the full force of it, for 13 minutes. So, what made Jarrell so extreme? Why did this tornado behave so differently from typical violent tornadoes? The answer lies in a meteorological feature that most people have never heard of, the outflow boundary. An outflow boundary is the leading edge of cool air that spreads out from a thunderstorm, like a ripple moving away from where a stone hits water. These boundaries are invisible to the naked eye, but they're critical to storm formation. They mark zones where cool, dense air from old storms collides with warm, unstable air, creating a horizontal spinning motion in the atmosphere. On the morning of May 27th, storms had rolled through central Texas overnight, leaving behind an outflow boundary draped across Williamson County. By midday, that boundary was sitting there like a loaded gun, just waiting for a trigger. And the trigger came in the form of extreme instability. CAPE values, the measure of atmospheric energy, were exceeding 6,000 joules per kilogram. Anything over 2,000 is considered very unstable. 6,000? That's explosive. That's the kind of energy that doesn't just build storms, it detonates them. But here's the unusual part. The wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was weak. Conventional wisdom says you can't get a violent tornado without strong wind shear. The setup looked perfect for hail, maybe some brief spin-ups, but not an F5. Conventional wisdom was wrong. What happened instead was that the outflow boundary itself provided the rotation. That horizontal spin along the boundary was tilted vertical by the monstrous updrafts, creating a tornado that was anchored to the boundary rather than to upper-level winds. And because the boundary was moving slowly, drifting southwest, the tornado moved with it, slowly, grinding over the same ground for minutes instead of seconds. This type of tornado, sometimes called a land spout when it's weak, became something meteorologists had rarely seen. A boundary-driven F5, a storm that moved the wrong direction, a vortex that stalled over a neighborhood and erased it from existence. The forensic analysis of the Jarrell tornado took months. Engineers from Texas Tech University, meteorologists from the National Weather Service, damage survey teams from across the country. They all descended on Jarrell to document what had happened, and what they found was unprecedented. The path length was 7.6 miles, not particularly long by tornado standards. The maximum width was 3/4 of a mile, roughly 16.2 kilometers. Large, yes, but not record-breaking. The duration was 13 minutes from touchdown to dissipation. Brief in the grand scheme of tornado history. But the damage. The damage was unlike anything most investigators had ever seen. Ground scouring, the removal of topsoil and vegetation down to bare earth, extended across the entire damage path. In some areas, the ground was scoured down 6 to 12 inches. Entire lawns just gone. Asphalt roads were peeled up in sections, chunks of pavement weighing hundreds of pounds hurled away like leaves. Trees weren't just snapped or uprooted, they were debarked, stripped completely naked, some reduced to splinters, others ripped entirely out of the earth with their root systems intact and thrown hundreds of yards away. And the homes, the 38 homes in Double Creek Estates, they weren't just destroyed, they were erased, swept from their foundations, reduced to fragments so small that investigators described the debris as granulated or powdered. Vehicles were mangled beyond recognition, twisted into abstract sculptures of metal, personal belongings, furniture, appliances, all reduced to unidentifiable mush. One investigator described it as looking like the area had been hit by a giant blender. Another said it looked like the neighborhood had been erased by God's hand. The violence was so extreme that in the immediate aftermath, responders struggled to differentiate between human and animal remains. Hundreds of cattle were killed in the surrounding fields, their bodies scattered across the landscape. This level of damage, this completeness of destruction, raised a question that engineers and meteorologists are still debating. What wind speed does it actually take to cause this kind of damage? Some engineers argued that given certain construction standards, the catastrophic damage could have been caused by winds lower than traditional F5 estimates. But meteorologists pointed to the ground scouring, the asphalt removal, the granulated debris as evidence of something beyond the scale, winds that might have exceeded 300 miles per hour in the most intense subvortices. The debate itself is a lesson. Our systems and labels falter in the face of such extreme events. Jarrell wasn't just an F5, it was simply Jarrell. A storm that redefined what total destruction means. In the days and weeks after the tornado, the community of Jarrell faced a decision that would define their recovery. How do you rebuild when the foundation itself has been scarred? FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, made a controversial decision not to provide federal disaster aid to Jarrell. The reasoning was complex, involving damage thresholds and insurance coverage, but the result was clear. The town would have to rebuild largely on its own, and they did. Volunteers poured in from across Texas and beyond. Blood donations flooded local hospitals. Construction crews worked for free, clearing debris, pouring new foundations, framing new homes. The community rallied around the survivors, around the families who had lost everything, around the memory of the 27 people who died. The Igo family, who lost 5 members in the tornado, donated land for what would become the Memorial Park Community Center, a lasting tribute to those who were lost. The center stands today as a reminder that when foundations are wiped clean, the only thing you have left to build on is community. Today, grass has grown back over the scarred earth of Double Creek Estates. New homes stand where the old ones were erased. Families live there. Children play in the yards. Life has returned. But the memory remains. First responders who were there that day still get nervous when storms build up. They remember the tornado, one said, and it still sends chills down their back thinking about it. So, what are the lessons of Jarrell? What does this tornado teach us 28 years later? First, not all tornadoes are created equal. The safety rules we teach, the get to an interior room advice, the stay away from windows guidance, those rules work for most tornadoes, but they have limits. And when you're facing an F5 or EF5 tornado, especially one that moves slowly and dwells over the same area, above-ground shelter may not be enough. If you live in tornado-prone areas and you don't have a basement, consider installing a safe room or storm shelter. These are reinforced structures, anchored to the foundation, designed to withstand EF5 winds. They're expensive, yes, but they work, and they're the only above-ground shelter that has been proven to survive direct hits from violent tornadoes. Second, atmospheric boundaries matter. The Jarrell tornado was a textbook example of how an outflow boundary, combined with extreme instability, can produce violent tornadoes even when traditional wind shear is weak. Forecasters today pay much closer attention to boundaries, using high-resolution models and radar to identify zones where rotation might develop. The Storm Prediction Center now includes boundary analysis in their severe weather outlooks, and local National Weather Service offices issue warnings based not just on radar signatures, but on the environment the storms are moving through. Third, slow-moving tornadoes are exceptionally dangerous. Speed matters. A tornado that races through at 50 miles per hour gives you seconds of exposure to the most intense winds. A tornado that crawls at 10 miles per hour, or stalls over a location, gives you minutes of exposure. And that difference is the difference between a damaged home and a vanished home. When warnings are issued for slow-moving tornadoes, take them seriously. Don't assume you can ride it out. Don't assume your interior bathroom will be enough. Get to the best shelter available, and if that means leaving your home and driving to a community shelter or a friend's basement, do it. Fourth, the outbreak context matters. Jarrell wasn't an isolated event. It was part of an outbreak that produced 20 tornadoes across central Texas that afternoon and evening. 4 other tornadoes were rated F3 or higher. One F4 tornado struck areas near Lake Travis and killed 1 person. An F3 moved across Cedar Park, damaging businesses and homes. This was a regional event, a day when the atmosphere was primed for violence across a wide area. And that's a reminder, when conditions are favorable for tornadoes, they're often favorable for multiple tornadoes. Don't let your guard down after the first warning. Stay alert, stay informed, and have multiple ways to receive warnings because, as Jarrell showed us, even radar can fail at the worst possible moment. There's one more lesson, and it's the hardest one to articulate, but perhaps the most important. Sometimes, nature is simply more powerful than our preparations. The people who died in Double Creek Estates did everything right. They heard the warnings. They took shelter. They protected their families. And it still wasn't enough. That's not a failure of the people. It's not a failure of the warning system. It's a recognition of the limits of human control. We can predict. We can prepare. We can build stronger. We can warn earlier. But we cannot stop a tornado. We cannot control the atmosphere. And when an F5 stalls over a neighborhood built on slabs, sometimes there are no good options. This doesn't mean we give up. It doesn't mean preparation is pointless. It means we approach severe weather with humility, with respect for the power of nature, and with a commitment to doing everything we can to protect lives, even knowing that we can't save everyone. The Jarrell tornado remains the last F5 tornado to strike Texas. In the 28 years since, the state has seen violent tornadoes, yes, but nothing that approached the intensity and completeness of destruction that occurred on May 27, 1997. It was the deadliest tornado in Texas since the Saragossa F4 in 1987, which killed 30 people. And it stands as one of the most studied, most analyzed, most feared tornadoes in American history. Not because of its size, not because of its path length, but because of what it did, because of how it moved. Because of the questions it raised about the limits of prediction, the adequacy of shelter, and the terrifying potential of atmospheric boundaries. Today, when meteorologists teach classes on severe weather, Jarrell is a case study. When engineers design safe rooms, Jarrell is the benchmark. When emergency managers plan for worst-case scenarios, Jarrell is the nightmare they prepare for. And when survivors tell their stories, when Kristen LaFrance sits in that leather recliner and remembers her father's last words, when Mallory Cantler-Sumner looks at the horizon and remembers the neighborhood that disappeared, Jarrell is a reminder. A reminder that we live in a world where the sky can turn dark in minutes, where the rules can be rewritten by a storm that moves the wrong way, where 27 lives can be taken in 13 minutes, leaving behind only bare slabs and questions that echo across decades, but also a reminder of resilience, of communities that rebuild, of survivors who find the strength to tell their stories, of first responders who answer the call even when the scene defies comprehension, of scientists who study the data, learn the lessons, and work to ensure that the next time, maybe, just maybe, we can save one more life. The sky over Jarrell is quiet now. The storms have passed, the scars have healed, at least on the surface. But if you stand in Memorial Park, if you read the names on the plaque, if you listen to the wind moving through the trees that have grown back over the scoured earth, you can still feel it. The weight of that day, the magnitude of what was lost, the power of a storm that moved the wrong way. And you understand why. 28 years later, we still talk about Jarrell, why we still study it, why we still remember. Because some storms don't just destroy buildings. They destroy assumptions. They destroy complacency. They destroy the illusion that we have everything under control. And in doing so, they teach us the most important lesson of all. Respect the sky. Heed the warnings. Protect your family. And never, ever underestimate the power of a storm that decides to break the rules.